My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm joined by Yazan Kopti, and we are very, very excited to be joined by our guest, Diana Abouali from the Arab American National Museum.
Thanks, Mikey. Hi, everybody. I'm notoriously bad at multitasking, so I'm in charge of flipping through the slides as we go. So if we get stuck on a slide, feel free, somebody, to just raise your hand or go like this, and I'll go to the next one. I'm really delighted to have Diana Abouali with us today. She's a dear friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time, and Diana currently serves as the director of the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And she's worked for a number of years in higher education and the cultural heritage sectors in the US, Palestine, and in Jordan. Diana holds a PhD in history and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University, and she was the assistant professor at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Languages and Literature at Dartmouth College between 2006 and 2012. After that, Diana was the head of research and collections at the newly established Palestinian Museum in Deir Zei, Palestine. She worked in Jordan after that in many different capacities as the director of education and outreach and awareness at the Petra National Trust, and also as a project manager at Tiraz, the Widad Karwar Home for the Arab Dress, which is one of my favorite museums, as we're on the topic. Spearheading a project there dealing with Syrian artisans and who had fled to Jordan. Diana also organized and delivered cultural heritage education workshops to Syrian children and women in Azra and Zaatari refugee camps in Jordan, and occasionally teaches college level courses in the US and Jordan. She is a member of the General Assembly of Ta'awan, the Welfare Association, which many of you probably know, the largest Palestinian NGO that provides development and humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in the occupied territories and in Lebanon. And she is a member of the board of directors of Arte East, and is a member of Citizens Advisory Committee at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. So quite a lot of things, quite a lot of hats that you wear, Diana. And I wanted to kick off the conversation. This was the slide that I wanted to have up as I talked about all of those institutions and positions. But I kind of wanted to kick off the conversation, Diana, talking a little bit and hearing from you a little bit about sort of the earlier part of your career in academia as a social historian, and how that led to what you're doing today with museums and your work in the cultural heritage sectors.
Sure. Thanks, Yazan and Mikey, for inviting me. And I'm really excited to be a part of this great initiative, afikra. Yeah, it's not just a kindness, but a pleasure to be here with you all. And thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so I started my kind of career, or my path as a student of history, and I got interested in history, and particularly in studying Palestinian history before 1948, and not just before 1948, but before sort of Jewish immigration to Palestine. So I was very curious about, what Palestinian society and culture was like before Palestine, the region, became politicized as it did after Jewish immigration, creation of the State of Israel, Zionism, what have you. And when I was coming of age in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the idea of Palestine as a place, as a land without a people, was still sort of a commonly held assumption, and people still talked about that. And so I was also, so history was something I was always interested in, and I ended up, going to graduate school for that and studying family history. So I ended up studying Ottoman history because, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire up until the early 20th century. And I wanted to so I started looking at Palestine within that Ottoman orbit, and I was interested in family history. So the question I was kind of trying to answer is, can you do a history of family in the Middle East, and in particular Jerusalem, which was the city I chose, and it happened to be in the 17th century. can you do a history of family in the Middle East without the kind of documents that, say, you have in Europe at the same time? So in Europe, you have, you know, an embarrassment of riches, you have diaries, you have letters, you have paintings, you have all this material you can work with to kind of rebuild that or reconstruct that history. What was life like? What was family life like in the past? In Jerusalem and Palestine, it's harder to do because we don't have those documents available. So I used court records to kind of reconstruct what a family was doing over 25 years, from about 1695, from 1595 to 1620. So, so that's what how I got into kind of academia and history, and it was a kind of, so there was that sort of intellectual curiosity, but I know Yezin knows a bit about my personal life. It was kind of I kind of ended up going to graduate school for not just for the intellectual kind of pursuit, but there were other reasons, personal reasons. But anyway, that led me, and you know, I got a job at Dartmouth right after I finished. I was really lucky to land there, first as a lecturer actually, and then as assistant professor. And I continued to teach about Middle Eastern, you know, history studies. I was in a language and literature department, so I had to teach a lot more about cultural histories than social history. So I talked a lot about, you know, you know, looking at the Middle East through literature, let's say, through film, what have you. But I decided at a point that even though I was very privileged to be at Dartmouth, and it was really a great place to teach because you know, you're dealing with the student body is really, you know, they're really smart kids. They're very motivated. It's a wealthy university, so the research funds are, you know, the support is there. But I wasn't happy. I think it was, you know, if I'm going to be brutally honest, I wasn't finding my kind of fit there. I felt like a misfit, and I think that goes back to the reasons why I went into graduate school. So while I was able to sort of ignore those issues, they, you know, for a long time, at the end, I kind of had to sort of be very frank with myself and say, okay, I've got one life to live. I might as well do something that gives me a bit more sort of personal satisfaction.
What role, because in the intro that Yezin gave, right, you're obviously very involved in a lot of different organizations in the culture space. What role do you think institutions like the Arab American Museum and like some of the other ones that you're involved in, what gap are they filling that maybe the academy and sort of universities are not? That maybe it's not a gap, but what is the work that you're doing that's complementary to the work that the academy is doing?
So we base a lot of our work on kind of scholarship, right? But what I think is different is that, you know, we're more of a public facing, we have a platform that reaches the public and the general public, as opposed to, say, a university where, you know, it's a kind of, you know, in a university, professors are teaching students, professors publish, and most of their publications are read by other scholars. At a museum, you're really, your audience is the general public. And so what you're doing is you're taking all the knowledge that, you know, scholars do and staff at the museum. I mean, they're either trained as scholars as well, they have PhDs or they have master's degrees, and they're presenting that knowledge in a way that is accessible to the lay public. So it's still sort of keeping it, you know, sophisticated and nuanced, but presenting it in a way that's accessible.
It was interesting kind of hearing you talk at the beginning that I didn't think about it until you said it out loud, but there's a lot of continuity between what you were sort of studying in academics and in an earlier period and what you're working on now at the Arab American Museum, because I feel like that social history is sort of the anchor of the museum, right?
Yeah, I mean, what we do here is tell stories about Arab Americans, not just we're telling their stories, but we're letting them tell their own stories. So, you know, a lot of, you know, our archives are full of documents, you know, objects, photographs donated by Arab Americans. We have an oral history project where we record the stories of Arab Americans. And we use those stories, those oral histories, the documents to shape the exhibits that we have. You know, and so it's very much my trajectory. It seems a little kind of, you know, I took a lot of turns, but in a way there was a constant in them, in that I was always very interested in history and culture, always interested in the Middle East, you know, specifically Palestine, but generally in the part of the world I come from.
Yeah.
And also about, you know, retelling and sharing with others, you know, what I love about this part of the world that I come from.
So the full name of the museum is Arab American National Museum, and then subtext in Dearborn, Michigan.
In Dearborn, Michigan.
Yeah. So can you talk about that duality, being a community-facing museum in a community like Dearborn with a huge population that's Arab American? The idea of being Arab American in Dearborn is front-facing. It's a huge part of the community. But you're a national museum, and so you're serving these two communities at the same time, and maybe even three when you think about the Arab world more broadly. How do you manage that triangulation?
It's very hard. So yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that we're located in Dearborn. I mean, for those of you who are, you know, listening in, Dearborn is, you know, arguably the capital of Arab America. Michigan, or this area of Michigan, Southeast Michigan, has the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the nation, not numbers and population, but just the concentration. Dearborn is very much, you know, an Arab town. Like, there's Arab signs all over. People speak Arabic. It's a very particular and unique. It's a unique place. And we're a part of an organization called Access, which is the Arab American Center for Economic and Social Services. This is a human services agency that was set up in 1971 to assist the new Arab immigrants, you know, providing them services, translation, how to get your, you know, driver's license, whatever. And that has become the largest Arab American nonprofit. So we're part of this legacy of social work and community building. And we grew out of a cultural arts project or program in Access. So yeah, we're very much a community, but we're very planted in, we're in East Dearborn, which is the center of the center, kind of. But we try to, you know, at least since, you know, since I've come, which is, I've only been here about a year and a few months, really trying to reach out to the national Arab community. And that's hard to do because you're right, we're so located and associated with Michigan. And the idea of an Arab American identity, it's not a clearly defined one, right? You're not just, you know, you're trying to represent people who come from 22 different countries that, you know, span 2 continents, right? And not everybody from these countries is necessarily Arab, and not everybody from these countries, even if I would consider them Arab, don't self-identify as Arab. So, you know, who is an Arab American? That's a question we keep trying to ask, we keep asking ourselves. And so we're trying to, you know, and you have to also buy into the idea that there's an Arab identity, right? You know, versus you know, Palestinian identity, or, you know, an Egyptian or Sudanese, or so. It's hard, but what's funny is that since we've gone remote with COVID and our closing to the public, and we've you know, shifted to online programming, we've really been able to reach this national audience in ways I don't think we had been successful before. And I think we found a kind of niche, or we've scratched some sort of itch where there is an Arab American community there that is, you know, interested in listening to poets who identify themselves as Arab American, or write Arab poetry, or, that hear music, to watch chefs create dishes that are Arab. I mean, so there is something there, but it's a very, it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. And if you want to think about it, critically, it's it's, what are we trying to do? And it's constantly shifting, this definition of Arab American, I think.
I mean, it's funny because these are questions. Oh, sorry, Deanna, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
It's funny because these are questions that we ask in afikra. I mean, we have these conversations all the time about what does it mean when we say the history of the Arab world and the culture of the Arab world. Also with COVID, I think we've also realized that, we've had these super localized programs in cities, and the community around them was really, it has its own feel and it has its own sort of magic to it. But then also moving online, being forced to move online, has actually connected us to a much bigger, and connected the people in the community to a much bigger kind of network. And has brought up those questions again, I think, right, Mikey, about who is Arab and what are we talking about and what does it cover? So I'm also curious to know, like in Dearborn, because it's such a specific place, what does the Arab American community look like in Dearborn, and what is their relationship to sort of the Middle East and their home countries, the 22 different countries that they come from, and the sort of community that they've created in the United States?
So Dearborn, as far as I understand it, demographically now, it's essentially, it's mostly either Lebanese and Lebanese Shia. It's Yemeni, there's a large Yemeni community, and Iraqis. And so their connection, to their, to the homeland, to their places of national origin, is still very strong. The Yemenis and the Iraqis are, although the Yemenis have been here for many, since the early 20th century, a lot of Yemenis have come since with the war and the humanitarian crisis. So it's a younger kind of immigrant population. Likewise with the Iraqis, with the Iraq War and the like, there's been more of an immigration. So the connections with back home are still very strong, and it affects them, and so that connection is still there. But with the Lebanese, they're much more, I think, they've also been here, like the Yemenis, since the early 20th century, and they, the Syrian Lebanese, in many ways, were the kind of, I think, the main community here in Dearborn and in Michigan. So their ties to this part of the country are longstanding and are very, very deep, but yet still, very much tied to Lebanon. Like many of them who have grown up here, third, fourth generation, some of them still go back to Lebanon every summer when they can. So, but the identity of a Dearborn Arab American is, again, you can stereotype and say there is, but it's a very rich and diverse identity. But it's one that I think, for the residents are very confident and in expressing what that identity might be, whether it's Arab, whether it's Arab Muslim, whether it's Iraqi. And I find this young generation very confident in their identities as well. And I think that comes from living in a community that is, very Arab, proudly Muslim, proudly Arab, and there are Christians here as well. It's not just but I think in this part it's majority Muslim, very comfortable in their skin, and says someone who's approaching 50. I didn't see this when I was in the U.S. as a college student back in the 90s. And I don't think I saw it anywhere else in the U.S. except for really here. So it's an interesting place where, for the first time, really, I see this very confident Arab American identity.
Do you feel? So I'm curious also about the audience in the Arab world. and how the audience in the Arab world views the work that the museum is doing. Because I think there's a really like interesting thing happening as sort of global travel becomes more and more easy in the towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, that these communities are, these diaspora communities are fluid and people are going back and forth. And so do you feel like you have a responsibility as a museum to kind of tell the immigrant story back to the region and say, no, this is a valuable, rich culture. This Arab American community is a valuable, rich culture. And it's, you know, we are a dynamic thing.
Our work is directed mostly towards the domestic, you know, the US community, right? Yeah. I don't think we think of programming or whatever we do in terms of the international or the Arabs back, you know, the Arab community in the Arab world. But your point is well taken, that we are telling the story of Arab immigration to the United States, and the history of acculturation of the Arabs into this country, and the sort of successes and the achievements that they were able to accomplish. So in a way, yes, we are, you know, if we were to address them directly, this is what we would say, is that there is a community here that is very conscious of their Arab roots, and a very vibrant one. I mean, one of the more, you know, we this year is the 100th anniversary of the Pen League, which is the Rabit al-Qalamiyya, which is the group of literary group that Khalid Gibran and Ali Abu Mahdi and those figures developed, you know, created in New York. And so, you know, what we try, you know, for Arab Americans, it's very important because it's this accomplishment that happened here, right? But it's very important to remind, you know, to keep reminding people that, you know, this also impacted the, you know, development of Arab literature and poetry back in the homeland. So there is there is cultural production here. There are accomplishments that do affect things back home. And yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but no. You know, we don't program for Arabs back home, but I think it's a good thing to start thinking about more intentionally, because there are a lot of linkages, there are a lot of connections, and, you know, movement of ideas and people are constant. So we should maybe we should start thinking about that.
Because I mean, before Yazan, I pass it to you, like as a kid of both a Lebanese parent born and raised in Lebanon and a Lebanese immigrant parent born in the States, I do get the sense, at least internally, that there's like this Arab American community that feels like what they're producing doesn't ever feel like the Arab stuff that they're producing never like fully can live up to the Arab stuff being produced by their long lost cousins in the Arab world, and that's just like not true. And so telling the legitimate story is like useful.
Because it's kind of a fraught thing, I think, even for Arab Americans, and depending on like their story of how they came here and when they came here, the relationship, I think, like sometimes not being able to speak Arabic or not being able to produce things in Arabic feels, you know, it feels embarrassing, or it feels like that's not Arab enough. I mean, it's one of the questions that comes up in afikra about, you know, that this is not a competition, who's more Arab than who. But I'm kind of curious with, you know, this idea of, because you had mentioned to me in other conversations about how there's sort of a, for lack of a better word, a sort of hybrid culture that happens where you have, you know, smaller populations of different national origins in one location interacting with each other, and being in the United States kind of produces, you know, its own sort of culture where things feel a little bit different than they would back home, but there is a conversation between them. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe how does that fit into, you know, where did the museum start in 2005 as far as who were you considering in this idea of Arab American, and how has that shifted over the years. I'm sure things like September 11th probably was a major turning point in how people identified and self-identified. And maybe how is that part of the museum's kind of vision for the next 5, 10 years? It's a lot there, so just pick whatever you want.
Yeah, no, I mean, I should say, so when the museum opened in 2005, so we opened in 2005, which means that work on the museum was happening, you know, in the 4 to 5 years beforehand. So right after 9/11, which I think, and if I understand the history correctly, and again, this is way before my time here, is that the events of September 11th really galvanized and pushed, you know, access to, like, say, okay, we need to sort of set up this museum so that it can be a place where there is, you know, accurate or information on Arab Americans that's based in fact and research, and, you know, and that's accurate. But so the kind of the face of Arab America at that time, and at least in terms of, you know, what the Arab American Museum was trying to paint was trying to be as representational as possible. But I think, you know, it was, you know, if you go through the exhibits, you don't see a lot of it doesn't reflect the demographics of today, only because it was built 15 years ago and a lot has changed in the last 15, 20 years. So we're very aware that we're not representing the current face of Arab America. We need to have more African Arab representation, tell their stories, more North Africans, Yemenis need to be sort of, you know, included and their stories discussed. We do that, but not to the extent that, say, you would find about Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian. And that's, I think, because that was, from my understanding, the sort of the dominant community and what people here are and who they know, even though there was a sort of national program or project to collect as much stories and objects and documents as possible. Mm-hmm. But that's something that we're very aware of, and we are very committed to changing that. At this point, it's a funding issue too. I mean, redoing your exhibits costs a lot of money, but we are it's a priority for us. And so we're very keen on addressing that shortcoming that we have, but we try to make up for it in our programming. So that programming is much more flexible, and we try to really address those gaps that we have in our permanent exhibits and the core exhibits through the programming that we do, and that there's a wide range and spectrum of what it means to be Arab American. In terms of what you were asking me about, how these sort of hybrid cultures evolve in Dearborn. So I'm not from Dearborn, and I came to Dearborn really for the first time when I started this job. And as somebody who, I was born in Canada, I grew up in Kuwait, I came to the US when I was 18 and lived here for 20 years. You know, I lived in the East Coast, which doesn't have that, you know, the Arab Americans have been there for many years, but I wasn't part of an Arab American community in the East Coast, apart from my, you know, best friends, many of whom were Arab. But here, it's interesting for me, just as a historian or as somebody who's attuned to these things, that yeah, it's certain rituals and aspects are very familiar, but very, very different. And my favorite example is a very kind of macabre one, and it's about mourning and funeral rites. It's very different than what I'm used to back home. But what it is, it's an Americanized way of, you know, dealing with death rituals in the United States by, you know, Arab communities, whether they're Sunni or Shia. So these kind of things I pick up on and I find very interesting, but it's just, you know, it's funny to see how something as, you know, sort of, I don't know, how cultural practices and rituals change when, you know, they're taken from the place of origin and they have to sort of adapt to a new environment. So. Great.
Deanna, I think we're going to do this quick Q&A, and then we're going to shift into the group Q&A. Okay, let's go ahead. Yazan, do you want to read them, or should I?
Sure. So Deanna, our first question is, what are you reading, watching right now?
Okay, what I'm reading right now is actually a book called The Heritage. I brought it with me because it's called The Heritage, Black Athletes, A Divided America and the Politics of Patriotism. And it's by someone called Howard Bryant. He's a sports journalist. And I'm very interested in sort of the athlete activist, like Muhammad Ali or John Carlos, if people know who these are. And so it reminds me of like, I don't know, it's like the committed Arab, literary literature person and writer. So it's very interesting how sports and politics are very much intertwined, even though we think of sports as just a pastime. And I'm not an athlete at all. I don't do sports, but I think because my obsession actually started with Muhammad Ali, because when I was growing up in Canada, his name was very close to my father's name, which was Muhammad Abouali. And I think I grew up with some sort of thinking they were related, or I don't know. I've always been obsessed with Muhammad Ali. And also his story of his activism, his conversion to Islam, and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm reading now, in addition to, of course, other books that are, I start and finish. Watching.
Oh no, I was going to say, have you seen When We Were Kings?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I just have to, because you were about to say what we're watching. I was like, if you haven't watched this, you have to watch When We Were Kings.
Yeah, no. I watch all those things. And again, I'm not an athlete. I'm not even an athletic supporter. Like, I don't even watch any sports. But there's something about, the athlete, the obsession of people with sports. Maybe they're responsible. Do they have a responsibility? I don't know. So it's an interesting thing to think about, I think.
Totally a contemporary question, obviously. In the States, this is a contemporary question that's coming up in football.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the idea of the book is that, it used to be that a lot of the athletes, Black athletes, were very political. That in the 70s, 80s, once all these endorsements and, the commercialization of the athlete, they took a step back and stopped being as political as they could be. And now we see a return to that sort of origin with Kaepernick, with LeBron James and what have you.
Bill Russell is my absolute hero, because he did it in so many unglorified ways. He's amazing. The Bill Russell story is incredible. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
So I don't know. So this one, I'd rather live in a past, like in a period in the past, rather than shadow somebody in particular. Okay. So I studied 17th century Jerusalem. I would love to spend a day there. What did the city look like? I don't know, just be around people. That's sort of what I would like, go to El Hamra and be a princess in the palace for a day. That's what I would like to do, rather than shadow somebody in particular.
Fact check, make sure everything that you've researched and come up with is actually what it was.
Yeah, but it's also like, what did it smell like? What did it, was the air a lot cleaner? There was no, pre-industrial, I don't know, the world before industry. What did it smell like? Maybe bad, I don't know. I don't know.
So what do people most misunderstand about your work?
People think that museums are just sort of, we're a history of immigration. We talk about Arab, we promote Arab culture and history. And I think there's a misunderstanding that we need to be neutral, not take a political stance. And I think we always, museums are not neutral. I know that's a sort of slogan, but it's true. I think museums have a real responsibility to take a stance politically, to be very frank and honest about, their role in, maybe enabling or creating or contributing to systemic racism. I mean, not a museum necessarily like ours, but these larger encyclopedic museums that we find in America, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the British Museum, what have you. So I think that's the misunderstanding, that we're sort of, we're just presenting culture, but everything is political. And I think museums have a responsibility to address that aspect of the work.
And our last quick fire question is, whose work do you admire and are inspired by?
So that one also, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are a few people that whose works I like. For instance, there's a historian called Louise Thatcher Ulrich, and she wrote a book called The Handmaid's Tale, not The Handmaid's Tale, sorry, that's, no, The Midwife's Tale, sorry. And it's a sort of, it's like a micro history. It's a history of a woman who was a midwife in Maine in the 18th century, and she left a diary, like and her diary entries were telegraphic. But from that diary, from those telegraphic diary entries, Louise Thatcher Ulrich was able to create this panoramic view and understanding of what life was like in that part of the world. And so after reading that, which to me read like a novel, I mean, it's just a masterful piece of work, you know, then I was like, oh, I wish I had written, or I could write something like that. So that's kind of what I'm inspired by. I'm inspired by like the writings of Rebecca Solnit. She's a, you know, a beautiful writer and essayist. And I'm also inspired, I mean, but I don't have heroes, so to speak. But, you know, just inspired by people who can do amazing things. Like, again, back to the athletes. Like, I am not an athletic, like I said, you know, very clumsy and what have you. But to be able to express yourself, like say a dancer, express yourself through your body is just, to me, you know, I can't even understand what that is like. So that's the kind of thing I think inspired by, things I would like to be able to do, or just even to feel what it'd be like for a day or something. I don't know.
Great. Okay, so we're going to switch to the questions now. We have the first four, just so everybody hears them at the same time. The first four are going to be Angelica, then Salah, Rose, and then Marianne Peters, and then hopefully we can get to more. But Angelica, go for it.
Hi, Diana. Thank you for your time and for sharing a little bit with us. My question is, what's your favorite object in the museum, or when you're bringing a guest there for the first time, what's the first thing you take them to?
Thank you, Angelica. That's a great question. My favorite object is there are a pair of shoes that were worn by a woman called I think her name is Saad Abdullah, and she was Syrian. And these shoes they're kind of like Mary Jane's with a bit of a heel, and they're entirely done in beadwork. And they're beautiful. And she wore them as she, you know, when she came across the, you know, from her home in Syria over to the United States. But unfortunately, she had to return back to Europe because of, she had an illness and they wouldn't let her in through Ellis Island. And then she came back again. She was able to re-enter. So those are my favorite, because you think it starts thinking of shoes and walking in her shoes, but the object itself is really beautiful, and I had never really seen beaded shoes. The entire shoe is beadwork, so it's quite beautiful. And I think we see it on our website. So
nice, that's lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks, Angelica. So next up is Saleh.
So my question is, do you have a plan to launch an Arabic version of the museum's website, as do other museums like the Japanese American National Museum, which has Japanese version, and the Chinese American Museum as well?
Yeah, Saleh, thank you for that question. We are very much aware that we need to provide, you know, Arabic language content in our museum and on our website. That's a bit of an undertaking that we need to sort of do that. We're planning for that. Inshallah, we can. It just involves a lot of, there's some things that we need to have in place before we can do that. But I understand I appreciate your point, and your point is very well taken. And we should have Arabic language on our website. We just launched the new website as well. So if you go visit it, that's only been up for a few weeks. And hopefully slowly we'll start to add more and more Arabic content.
We have Rose next, and then Marianne after that. Rose?
Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for this. I love what you said about museums being community spaces. And I was just wondering what you do to invite people into the museum space who may feel intimidated by it or may not relate to it kind of on the off, and how important it is for you to connect them, especially that audience, to those histories that relate to them.
Thanks, Rose. Yeah, when we were open before we closed, we were aware of that there is that sort of reputation that museums have, that somehow we're a little elitist, even though we really are not. But what we try to do is we do a lot of programming for families and for children. And that's one way to get them into the museum. So we do like a Halloween party, we have our Eid party, and we have a Christmas party. And those are open to the public. They're free, except for the Halloween. If you're an adult, you have to pay. But so that's one way to get kids and people into the museum. They can go through the exhibits. We have scavenger hunts. So we try to make it a fun space for people. And that's one way. Another way is we have a lot of school visits, school groups that come. And it's one way not just to teach about Arab American history, but to show them that this museum is really, a resource for them. It's a place that they can come to, and it can be fun. And we also, we have a lot of spaces that we rent to the public. And it can be used for anything. And we keep our prices very, very low. And sometimes we don't even, charge community groups to use them. So I think, and we're programming also, we and this is targeting maybe more of youth or young people, is we try to bring, we have a really great public programmer here at the museum, and she's very attuned to, the kind of music and performances that people like. And I think that's a really good way to bring people in, is that we try to be on top of what appeals to this younger generation of Arab Americans, and even not even Arab Americans. It's, we get our audiences are very, very mixed. So those are some ways we do it. We were planning to do more community outreach and try to figure out, why our immediate neighbors don't come to us as much. And I don't know if it's just that when you have a tourist destination in your backyard, you don't go, or whether there is a sort of, a disconnect, or they don't feel welcome. But then, we had COVID and that kind of stopped things. But we try our best to make sure that, this is a very welcoming space. We have a library that's open. It's not a public library, but people can come in and use it. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Let's take 3 more questions. I think we have enough time for 3. So we'll have Marianne, then we'll have Farah, and then we'll have Layla.
Hi, Deanna. I'm Marianne in Seattle, and I've been on a panel for the museum in its early days, which was really quite something. And I also just want to do a shout out for your librarian, because I've been able to call them directly and ask them questions and have them research for me from this distance. So it's been really a great thing about the museum. My question is, I happen to come from a family who anglicized their names. My grandparents both immigrated here at the turn of the 20th century and anglicized our name to Peters from Butras. And I'm curious how you trace histories in your archives from these hybridized communities or families whose names or their origins are in question.
I don't know the answer to that question specifically. I mean, we may not trace, but I guess, is your question like, if someone like you with Peters came and said, I'm Arab, what could my original name be? Is that the question?
It would be close to that, and also to find the lineage of migration. I mean, I've been able to find a lot of information just in general, historically, but to be more specific about my family, it's a little bit the family lore as much as anything.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not going to even speculate, but if you came to me with that question, I would say go talk to our research and content manager, and he will know what to tell you. Yeah, I'm not a historian of Arab American, the Arab American community. So it's not, I can't answer that question, with any accuracy, but I wouldn't know who to send you to. But yeah.
Archive, like what is the museum's archive collection? Does it include these sorts of like personal family documents? Is it more like, give us a little overview of that. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, so in the archive, there are sort of collections of documents that are given by, like, a lot of them are family papers from particular people. For instance, Evelyn Shackett, who was a writer, Arab American, donated, family papers from her parents and hers to the museum. So we've got that collection. We might have some, there are some family trees, but they're very, as far as I understand, very specific to those families. So we're not so much, I think, able to, as far as I understand, able to kind of trace lineage and ancestry, although we might be able to direct you to how to find that, whether it's through figuring out when they came, looking at ship manifests. I don't know, directing you to Ellis. I'm not really sure, and that's not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination. But I would know, we would probably be able to sort of direct you in a way where you could find the information that you're looking for.
Hi. Thank you for this. Just a quick question, and considering like in a non-COVID world where travel was still a thing, were there any plans for traveling exhibits or things that would maybe start in Dearborn and branch out to other cities across the US and maybe adapt to the audiences there, or maybe stay as is, but just kind of reach out to different communities so that more people could be exposed to the work that the museum is doing?
So we have had traveling exhibits in the past. We've had a few. One was about Little Syria, which is about the Arab American community in Lower Manhattan. We recently had one called it's called Where We Came From, which is it was photographs of objects that Syrian and Iraqi refugees had brought with them when they came, like they brought with them from their homelands to the United States. And the photographer took a picture of those objects and then given back to the owner, and they would write some sort of commentary on it, whether it's in English or Arabic. And those exhibits sort of toured the country. And that second exhibit, the one about the photography, I think in every city, the photographer might have sort of interviewed new people and added to the exhibit. So it seemed to kind of grow as it toured the country. But we're not so many of our exhibits, I think, sort of grow in that way. Although it's a great idea. But I know there's one exhibit here called Halal Metropolis, which is not affiliated with us, but with the University of Michigan. And that's one that seems to sort of grow with, it kind of travels around Michigan and grows as it does that. But we do some touring exhibits, but we probably need to do a bit more once things open up and we can start doing that again.
Let's end with Leila.
Hi, Diana. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I had a question about your career and the presence of Arab American art or history, basically. It can be really whichever one you choose. But since you began your career and you left the US for a bit and then returned, have you seen a larger presence in the documentation of Arab American art and or history? And if you have, this is again a very specific question, I know we're short on time, but what do you attribute to that presence?
Leila, are you asking if there's more interest in Arab American art since
Yes,
I left?
that's what I mean. If there's more of an interest in even the preservation or documentation of that.
I think so. Although I think so. I mean, there's more. I think there's more. You know, there are more people studying Arab American art. I believe at the at the university level. We remain, as far as I understand, the only institution that actively, well, we don't actively because we don't have a budget to purchase art, but we, are intentional about trying to collect Arab American art. Mm-hmm. And, but I think there's a lot more, what that's attributed to, I think the maturity of the community and the fact that there are a lot of really great Arab American artists who are, actually contributing to the conversation of art in general. And it's not just about being Arab American, but about being an artist and a good one and pushing the kind of the conversation forward, or pushing the mediums forward. But I think there's also, a question about, I'd like to see more of it, more interest in it, more platforms for artists to show their art, more conferences about what Arab American art is. Is there such a thing as Arab American art? And if there is, what is it, and what are the kind of issues that it deals with? So I see, and to be honest, again, I wasn't as sort of tuned into, Arab American arts. I knew about Arab American artists, but I didn't really know much about it as a kind of, let's say, movement or a group. But I think there seems to be more interest, I think, because of the maturity of the artists and the artwork itself in the community.
Thank you so much.
And that Arab Americans are probably going into and studying art history as well. So there's a sort of sensitivity to it.
Thank you so much again.
Thanks,
Leila. Deanna, thanks so much for joining us. I want to thank Yazan as well. This has been a huge pleasure to have you on the show and to have you share your insights and your perspectives and spread the word about what the museum is doing, both in Dearborn and around the world. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure and fun, and thanks for thanks for the opportunity. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for all the questions.
Guys, bye. Thank you.